Hello, this is Getting Started with SharePoint Framework, Tutorial 1, HelloWorld WebPart, and December 2017 edition. This is one of those tutorials which are available from docs.microsoft.com/SharePoint in the written format. So we walk through the steps which are in the written format in this video. Notice though that the written format of the documentation might evolve slightly faster than this video, so the written format is always up to date if you're watching this later, and we have introduced some changes in the process. Now let's actually get started on the tutorial process. So what I have here, I've installed all of my required setup and installed Yeoman templates, installed Node.js on my machine, and after that we can actually start walking through the process of creating our first web part. And what we want to do first is simply create a web part or folder for our solution. So let's actually write that one, HelloWorld WebPart, and move into that one as well. So I'm using a Windows 10 machine and a Commander. You could be using also PowerShell. You could be using any other command line tooling. You might be using a Mac or Linux. It really doesn't matter what operating system you're using. As long as you follow up on the getting started on development environment, you are good to go on creating these web parts in practice using the Yeoman templates available for SharePoint Framework. So now we are in the solution folder, and in here we want to create our actual solution. So we're going to start the Microsoft SharePoint Framework Yeoman template generator. So Microsoft /SharePoint, and that's going to then start the Yeoman generator. So I'm going to slightly scroll up so you can actually see all of the answers as we move along. So first of all, we wanted to start with the default solution name based on the guidance. We are targeting this example to the SharePoint Online. If you would be targeting to SharePoint on-premises and online, you would be using slightly different version of the SharePoint Framework, because the SharePoint 2016 is using an older version of SharePoint Framework. So, but in this case, we're going to use the SharePoint Online only. And we're going to use this current folder where we want to scaffold the solution. The following question is around availability of the capabilities in the solution. So if you want, you can immediately get your web parts available across your tenant whenever the solution has been deployed to the app catalog. Or it might be a web part which requires to be installed on a specific site before it's available for the end users. So in this case, we can use that second option, which is that it's not immediately available within a tenant level. So let's answer no on that one. And we want to actually create a web part. So let's actually choose a web part from that selection. So what's the web part name? For the initial HelloWorld web part, we can use the default name, and we can also use the default description. Then the Yeoman template is asking what framework you would like to use. Now, the important thing here to remember and realize is that this is not the set of frameworks which are actually supported in the Yeoman in the SharePoint framework. You can actually use whatever JavaScript framework you want. These are just the default scaffolding options. So you can absolutely still use jQuery or Angular or Vue or whatever is your preference. If you want to use any of those, you choose the No JavaScript framework, and then you add references to those JavaScript framework specific packages from the NPM as an example. So in this case, let's choose the No JavaScript framework, because that's the default starting point, and that starts the scaffolding process, which basically means that we're building the solution structure where we can then start implementing our custom implementation on top of the solution, where we will have now by default a one web part. You can absolutely have multiple web parts in a single solution. You can have extensions in a single solution on top of that one particular web part, which is now by default getting a scaffold. Because this scaffolding takes a few minutes, depending on your machine, depending on slightly on the versions what you're using, we're going to speed up the video to keep things interesting. So let's continue immediately when the scaffolding has been completed. And there we go. Now the scaffolding has been completed, and we are pretty much good to go for testing our web part in practice. There is one step which we do recommend you to do, which would be, let me actually clear that one up. So you'll do gulp trust dev cert, and this one will install a developer certificate to your machine so that you're able to use the HTTPS within your local host. And this will ease up the debugging and testing and development when you're using your local workbench or local host to host your local host to host the JavaScript files when you are actually in the context of SharePoint Online. So when I execute that one, that's going to actually open up the certificate and verification. So slightly again, depending on the machine and depending on the operating system, how these things are actually working. So in my case, this has been already executed within the machine, so there was no trust operation as such. But in your case, it might actually show you a pop-up and you need to trust that certificate. And after that, you're able to use the HTTPS within your local host. So in this case, anyway, let's proceed within the based on the written tutorial. So we'll test out our WebPart in practice. So I'm going to do gulp serve, which is going to then start the local workbench. So this is a workbench which can be used in a disconnected mode, and so you don't have to be connected on internet. You're able to do development and testing of your WebPart within this workbench. So and it mimics the SharePoint Online experience. So now in here, the default scaffolded HelloWorld WebPart is available, and I can select that from the WebPart picker. Clicking that one, we can see the WebPart available. By default, this out-of-the-box default scaffolded WebPart has a description field property under the group name. And if we update something like here, SharePoint framework is cool, you can actually see that the UI of the WebPart is getting reflected as well. And that's because the SharePoint framework client-side WebParts are responsive and they're, let's say, dynamic by the nature. If your WebPart property should not actually reflect or rewrite the WebPart UI immediately, and you would like to have an apply button in the WebPart panel, editing panel, that's absolutely possible as well. So it really depends again on the WebPart settings or configurations within your WebPart code. But that's the basic experience for getting the initial WebPart available, and you can immediately test that it's working by running the gulp serve, and that's typically what you do quite often as part of your development cycle. So you test something, you write something, then you do gulp serve, you make sure that it's rendering properly, then you go back on your Visual Studio site. So, or Visual Studio Code site, or whatever is actually your preferenced development environment. So in my case, I'm using Visual Studio Code, so I'm going to actually open up that one. I'm going to do a Control-C and break the local host to be running, and then I'm going to do code and dot, which will start then the Visual Studio Code in the context of that folder. And from here, we can then see the basic structure of the solution and how it was scaffolded and how it was actually created. Quickly walking through here what we have. So the configuration option, configuration folder, contains information like how do we package stuff, or how do we serve stuff, or how do we publish information, for example, in Azure CDN if you choose to do so. So this is more around configuration of the solution, like if we reference an external JavaScript library, all of those would be here. How do we actually package our solution? What's the name of the solution when it's getting packaged? What's the version? And all of that. Now, the dist folder is more around the bundled JavaScript, and essentially meaning whenever we do gulp serve, all of the TypeScript is getting transformed to be JavaScript so that it's supported by all of the browsers, and then this is actually where it's getting served for the browser. Lib is also around the runtime experience of your implementation, so you don't really have to worry about that one too much. Node modules are actually the dependent NPM packages which you are using within the implementation, or which was initially scaffolded in here. If you would, for example, add a dependency on Angular or any other framework here, we would install those to the NPM packages, and then you would have those JavaScript packages available underneath the node modules. It's almost like the NuGet package model in the .NET framework side, if you're familiar with that one. The source folder is around actually the source code of your solution. So if I quickly zoom in here, you can see that the default scaffolding because we chose to create a web part called HelloWorld, we actually got a web part underneath the web parts folder, and that's our HelloWorld web part. Now, if I would re-execute the Yeoman template in this folder and would add another web part or an extension, the source folder is actually the location where the additional scaffolding would happen. And then temp folder is just a temporary folder for Workbench hosting, so you can actually see the Workbench HTML here, and that's the one which is getting served when we are doing the call serve with the local Workbench option. And then a few additional configurations for files, which all do have a meaning, but you don't necessarily need to deep dive inside of them to understand how to make web part development, or at least how to get started with the web part development. Now let's open up our web part and let's have a look on the web part and the context of that web part. So there's a few different files related on the web part, and let's start with the web part class. And this one is the default scaffold HelloWorld web part. And you can see that we are referencing some of these packages and referencing some of the packages available in the solution. We also do have we also do have the web part props here, and that's for the actual web part level properties. And this is basically the interface which is defining what are the properties for the web parts, which are then exposed in the web part panel. Scrolling down, we can actually see the HelloWorld web part implementation, and this is inheriting from the base client-side web part, and we can see the render method of the web part as well. So this one basically is the one which is outputting the HTML for the web part and DOM structure in the UI. And that's really the key elements what you're seeing getting rendered in the browser. And as you can see, we are referencing styles here, we're referencing information in here, and also we have a properties.description getting rendered inside of the HTML. And this is where we are referencing the actual property which the end user is getting exposed in the property pane, or the property configuration, or the edit pane of the web part. So if we want to slightly evolve this one, we can absolutely do so. So let's actually add few additional properties, few additional things, and see how the web part property pane actually works. So let me add here a few additional property pane controls, and which we will use in the rendering. And then we want to evolve slightly our interface. So let's add a few additional properties here as well. So we'll have the test property, test 1, test 2, test 3. So we're able to show different controls and different controls getting rendered in the web part property pane. And then what we need to do to be able to actually expose these, we need to change our get property pane configuration and method. So this one is the one, or function. This one is the one which is telling SharePoint what are those properties which we want to expose in the property pane in the when we're editing the web part properties. So let me actually modify that slightly. So I'm going to take the content from the tutorial, or the written tutorial, and paste that one in and replace the existing implementation. And there we go. Now we are using the description property, the test property, test 1, test 2, and test 3 property. And we're able to see also here that we're using property pane text for test, like we did for the description. We're using a property pane checkbox for the test 1, which is actually a Boolean value. Here we're using a drop-down which I think it was at string value. Let's actually double check that one as well. It was a string value. And then the test number 3 was a Boolean value, where we can use then the property pane toggle, which is also doing on-off values, almost like the checkbox, but the UI rendering style is slightly different. So now we modified the settings, what is getting exported or exposed from the editing experience. But let's also actually get a output of the second value in our HTML. So I'm going to copy that one, and we want to update additional property to be available. Notice that we are using TypeScript here, so you have this intelligence options, and that's really the key value of the TypeScript. So you have this intelligence available, so you're able to see, for example, what are the property interfaces or the properties in this interface available. So I can now see, and I don't have a typos when I'm actually writing this. I'm able to now select the test property option from here. Good. So when we first run this web part, we actually did have some default values for the description property. How did that actually was done? Well, that was done by using the WebPart manifest. So if we open up the WebPart manifest, this is basically the same as .webpart file, if you're familiar with classic SharePoint. If you're not, that's absolutely fine. So, but this is the definition or introduction file for SharePoint. So basically telling SharePoint what is the web part or web parts available within this solution, and what are the default values of those web part properties, as an example. So the description default value was set to HelloWorld, so that whenever we initially executed that web part, we actually got the HelloWorld property there. And we now want to have default values for the other properties as well. So it's just a matter of, again, adding those things in the manifest. And in this case, we had a test 1, test 2, test 1, test 2, and test 3 properties, and we can set the default properties for them. Test 1 and test 3 were Boolean values, so we'll give a Boolean value for them. Test and test 2 were actually string values. So let's actually use those accordingly in the JSON definition as well. In general, you can see from here that we have the web part alias defined here. We have the unique ID of the web part here. We have the component type being web part. SharePoint Framework does support other component types as well. In this case, we created a web part, so the component type is web part. And these are then the actual web part level settings. For example, what is the title of the web part? And also what is the group of the web part. So underneath what group we can actually find this web part. And the group behavior is slightly different if you're using the modern UI of SharePoint or if you're using the classic UI of SharePoint, but it has exactly the same kind of a meaning. So where will that web part be exposed in the web part picker? And you can control those values in this JSON file. And also the description of the web part. So we did ask, for example, the title and the description of the web part in a Yeoman execution, and those values were updated in here. You can absolutely go and update the description afterwards as well. And you can also update, for example, what is the icon of your web part. So by default, we'll use page, but there's multiple other options and icons available. Good. I think we're ready to go and test this one in practice again. So let's go to the command line. Let's clear some of the stuff from command line, and let's do gulp serve. So the gulp serve is always starting the local workbench, but in this case we can absolutely also have a quick look on how the web part works in the online workbench. So the local workbench is here. We have the web part available, and we can actually see that there's multiple or additional value or additional property already exposed in here. Now, if we would like to use the online workbench, you can actually find an online workbench underneath every single SharePoint online site. And the value of the online workbench is that whenever you're actually interacting within the context of SharePoint, you want to actually get data from a SharePoint list, you want to get data from SharePoint user profiles or taxonomies or whatever, then you'll have to use the online workbench. So you'll be in the context of the SharePoint online site. So you're able to then access the information within a site. So the local workbench is more around testing the UIs and implementing functionalities which are not talking to SharePoint, and then the online workbench is more around the functionalities which are talking against the SharePoint online site using the REST APIs as an example. So in this case, I do have a modern group site or Office 365 associated group site here, and you can find the online workbench underneath every single site if you go to this URL. So what I did there is that I extended the URL with _layouts 15 and workbench.aspx, and that's basically the URL where you can always find the workbench. And that means that the code which is now getting executed is executing in the context of that site. So as an example, if you would in your code do something like, hey, on SharePoint, I want to access all of the lists within the site, and the context is defined by the URL where we are being executed, in the same way as the web part would be executed in the page context of the site. But when we're using the workbench, we don't have to deploy anything yet to the SharePoint, so we don't officially have to get this web part available, but we're able to test and do development in the context of SharePoint Online. So now if I go to the web part picker, we can see slightly more enhanced web part picker, so because this is already using the SharePoint Online context. So we can see all of the other web parts available there as well. We can see the sections. And if we scroll down on E in here, we can actually see our HelloWorld web part being available. So setting that here, you can actually see that the HelloWorld web part is available. And if we're interested, we can absolutely put this in the edit mode, and we're able to see also the additional configuration which we did for the web part. So we are able to then test and see these actual checkboxes and controls available based on the selections and based on the properties which we define for the web part, and also based on the default values what we defined in the web part manifest. But this is a good example of a reusable controls which are available for you, so you don't have to worry about rendering or implementing these controls. You just inherit or import them to your web part, and then you tell for the SharePoint framework to use them within your implementation. But good, that's it for this particular tutorial. This was the tutorial 1, where we actually just did the initial scaffolding of the web part and we get started on the SharePoint framework solution. In the next tutorial, we'll actually continue evolving this web part implementation and connect that to the SharePoint. So we'll be using the SharePoint list REST APIs to get access on the information on a SharePoint site. So please continue watching the videos or following up on the tutorials in the written format. Thank you.